Live from London, this is BBC News. The adult film star Stormy Daniels is giving evidence in Donald Trump's hush money trial.
I'm outside the court with the very latest of what promises to be a dramatic day of testimony.
Aid agencies warn it's almost impossible to help civilians in southern Gaza after Israeli forces move into Rafah, sealing off the two main crossings into the city. And these are pictures live from Rafah, where people anxiously await news of the latest ceasefire talks. Ukrainian intelligence says it's foiled a Russian plot to assassinate President Zelensky, reportedly timed for President Putin's inauguration. And floral extravagance on the red carpet as stars attend the Met Gala in New York. Hello and welcome. I'm Anita McVeigh and this is Verified Live, 3 hours of checking out the day's main stories and the facts behind them. Adult film actress Stormy Daniels, the person at the centre of the first criminal trial of a former US president, Donald Trump, has begun giving evidence in court. She's been called as a witness as prosecutors continue to argue the former president was responsible for illegally covering up a hush money payment to Ms. Daniels in the run-up to the 2016 election. Mr. Trump has pleaded not guilty to the charges and denies that he ever had sex with Daniels. Well, let's speak to our North America correspondent, Neda Tawfik, who is keeping across the court case for us. And Ms. Daniels is on the stand. What's she been saying, Neda?
That's right. Her testimony now is underway, and she began by just giving a bit of a biographical explanation of her difficult upbringing, saying that she had a mother who was neglectful, that she started working on the weekends as a teenager, dancing to earn extra money for the family before moving into working as a nude model in her 20s, and then on to eventually her work in the adult film world. And she went on from there to then introduce how she first met Donald Trump. What is now well known that she met him in 2006 at a celebrity golf tournament in Lake Tahoe. And that is really setting up this alleged sexual encounter with Donald Trump, which he denies. And Stormy Daniels was detailing how she was approached later in that tournament by Donald Trump's bodyguard, Keith Schiller, to have dinner with Donald Trump. And that was perhaps one of the more lighthearted moments of her testimony when she was said that she said no to having dinner with Donald Trump when she was asked to do that. Her exact words, F no. So Stormy Daniels, certainly a massive kind of witness in this case. Donald Trump is listening on intently while she's on the stand. The jury, even stirred as she walked in, is also listening very carefully to her testimony. And the defense tried to really block her from being able to speak about the alleged sexual acts with Donald Trump, saying that this is a case about books and records, ultimately about falsifying documents. But prosecutors said they would keep that questioning very limited. It wouldn't be too graphic, but just to establish Stormy Daniels' credibility as a witness in this case.
And yesterday, jurors saw a number of documents, didn't they, that prosecutors claim were falsified by Donald Trump in order to obscure the reimbursement of his then lawyer, who made a payment to Ms. Daniels. That's kind of at the heart of this, isn't it, Neda?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Look, hush money payment on its own isn't illegal. What's at issue here is the 35 documents that prosecutors alleged were falsified to hide election crimes that are connected to the hush money payment to Ms. Daniels. And so jurors saw the checks, the ledger entries, the invoices that prosecutors say prove that there was a cover-up to hide this conspiracy to influence the election in 2016. And while Donald Trump's lawyers tried to argue that those payments to Michael Cohen were just legitimate legal expenses, we heard a Trump Organization employee saying that he never saw a legal retainer for Michael Cohen. But in terms of having kind of solid proof connecting Donald Trump as the architect of all of this, I think Michael Cohen, his former lawyer, his testimony will be key.
Neda, thank you very much for keeping us up to date. Neda Tawfik there in New York at that trial of Donald Trump. And of course, if you want to keep right up to date with all the latest lines emerging from the trial and Stormy Daniels' testimony, she has, as you've been hearing, taken the stand at the Hush Money trial. You can do that on the BBC News website or the BBC News app and follow along live. The United Nations says Israel isn't allowing humanitarian workers access to the Rafah crossing after Israeli defence forces took control of the Gaza side of the crossing with Egypt. International aid agencies say the closing of the Rafah crossing, as well as the other main crossing, Karem Shalom, makes it virtually impossible to assist civilians inside the enclave. These pictures have been issued by the Israel Defence Forces, which say its troops are carrying out what they call a limited operation in Rafah. It says it's killed several Hamas fighters and has destroyed a number of tunnels. Aid lorries, meanwhile, are queuing up at the Rafah crossing, waiting to get into Gaza, as the UN demands the crossings be reopened immediately. Yolande Nell has sent us this report from Jerusalem.
Rolling into Rafah. Israeli tanks have now taken control of Gaza's key crossing into Egypt. The Israeli army says it's killed what it calls 20 Hamas terrorists and destroyed tunnels in a precise operation. But Palestinians mourning their lost loved ones say children were among those killed in the latest airstrikes. Mohammed Abu Amra has his family lined up in body bags.
My wife, my brother, my sister and niece were martyred. We did nothing. We were sleeping peacefully. We're not Hamas, nor any faction. I'm a construction worker.
What's happening in Rafah still falls short of the full-scale ground offensive that world powers have warned against in this city, crammed with displaced people. But there are new concerns that Israel has now closed the two main crossing points for aid to Gaza.
The Rafah crossing is now under control of the Israeli Defense Forces and is currently closed for the movement of goods and people in both directions. Kerem Shalom crossing is also closed, so that means that currently the two main arteries for getting aid into Gaza is currently choked off.
Last night, Gazans rejoiced after Hamas declared it had accepted a ceasefire proposal from mediators. But celebrations were short-lived as Israel said its core demands weren't met and that it would continue negotiations. Israelis supporting the hostages took to the streets, demanding a deal to bring them back. Relatives of those still held captive accused their Prime Minister of putting his own political survival ahead of their loved ones. Some went to Parliament today.
There are civilians there who need rescuing, soldiers who need rescuing. And so far, what I'm seeing is the state of Israel and Netanyahu are simply delaying.
Back in Rafah, Israel has again been ordering Palestinians to leave the east. After 7 months of war, an end had seemed tantalizingly close, but now there's more painful uncertainty.
And that was Yolande Nell. Well, our team at BBC Verify have been looking at the images released by the Israeli Defence Forces. Here's Merlin Thomas.
The Israeli army has said it's gained operational control of the Gaza side of the Rafah crossing here. The Israelis say they've done this because mortars were fired from this area, killing 4 of their soldiers. Now, we haven't verified this ourselves, but we have verified several videos of Israeli armoured vehicles circulating on social media, including this one, which appeared online this morning. Now, it shows a tank ramming into 2 Palestinian flags at the crossing on the Gaza side. Now, the long shadows stretching on the ground from the west to the east suggest this was filmed early in the morning. And we've located it to here by looking at pictures and satellite imagery of the crossing. Now, overnight, there was continuous Israeli bombardment on the border city. And we verified this video, which was sent to the BBC by someone in Khan Yunis looking towards Rafah. And you can see flares in the skies over Rafah. Now, Israel says a number of Hamas fighters have been killed, but there are also reports of civilian casualties too. And Israel says it's warned people of its strikes. And one way they say they do this is by dropping leaflets from the sky. And you can see that in this video. So we verified this video east of Rafah, and these white specks you can see falling to the ground are those leaflets. And this is what one of those leaflets looks like. Yesterday, Israel directed people in the eastern part of Rafah to move to what they call humanitarian areas. So moving from here to here. And this is a satellite image of one of those areas, north of Khan Yunis. This is from the 24th of April, and we counted 13 shelters here. And then this is from the 5th of May, and you can see there are many, many more of them. Now, we can't tell how many of them are occupied, but the Israeli army have said that this military operation isn't yet the full-scale ground offensive that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has talked about. The US has warned against such an offensive because of what it says are the dire humanitarian consequences in a city where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who fled fighting elsewhere in Gaza are still sheltering.
And I spoke earlier to our security correspondent Frank Gardner, who's in Jerusalem, and asked him how negotiations are faring and what it will take to get a deal across the line.
Well, the ceasefire talks are in play, although there aren't direct talks yet between the Israeli and Hamas delegations. In fact, there never were direct talks, they were always through mediators. The good news is that unlike last weekend, when Israel didn't bother sending a delegation to Cairo because they didn't think Hamas's proposals were serious enough or Hamas's position was serious enough, this time they have sent a delegation. It's just arrived in Cairo. These are mid-level technical experts from Mossad, Shabak, and the Israeli Defense Force. They are there to study the Hamas proposals and basically look for ways of closing the gap between what Hamas is prepared to accept and what Israel is prepared to accept. The fundamentals are pretty much agreed. You know, fundamentally, this involves a set 42-day period of calm during which there'll be an exchange of prisoners. But there's a kind of bit of sniping around at the edges here, and I think the main sticking point which Israel is objecting to is how this ends, because Hamas wants an undertaking that at the end of this ceasefire process, the fighting stops and Israel commits to no more fighting. The problem for Israel, or particularly for the Israeli government rather, because there are plenty of people in Israel who just want to take the deal. The hostage families are saying, stop messing around, do the deal, bring the hostages home. But the Israeli government has set out, this hardline right-wing government has set out its war aims as being two things: destroy Hamas and bring the hostages home. Well, the critics of the ceasefire deal say, if we sign up to a deal that leaves elements of Hamas still intact, underground, in tunnels, in Hamas, especially Yahya Sinwar, the architect of the October the 7th massacre, then Israel is simply laying itself open for another October the 7th, which Hamas has promised to do. So that's what's holding back the Israeli government, but there is enormous international pressure on both sides, but right now I'd say primarily on the Israeli side, to hurry up and do this deal.
Frank Gardner. Well, let's get more now on those ceasefire talks. I'm joined by Nawaf Falani, who is a former Qatari Director of Defence Intelligence Operations and Defence Attaché to the United States. Thank you very much for your time and for joining us on BBC News. How far apart do you think the two sides actually are in these negotiations?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Right now, the ball is clearly in the Israeli government's court. They have the clearest deal to this point that the mediators have reached and that Hamas has agreed upon. We haven't gotten to this point in the past where all hostages by the end of this deal would have been returned. Now, what the Israelis would do, we don't know. What we see is they're advancing in Rafah, which seems counterproductive to at least the negotiating part of the deal, which is the beginning. Unfortunately, this shows bad faith if they continue in the excursion and the invasion of Rafah. With the closing of the borders right now and no aid going in, this is certainly not a good start.
I spoke a little earlier to the daughter of one almost 84-year-old hostage who said that, she just wanted to see Benjamin Netanyahu get this deal done, whatever the cost, in order to get the hostages home. The competing pressures are huge for him at the moment: political, military, public. Where do you think he will move next?
Well, it's unclear. Right now, here in Qatar, the negotiators, the mediators who have, the eyes are on another capital in the Arab world, which is Cairo. They're there right now with the Americans and obviously the Egyptians to move forward the negotiation. The sense is that Netanyahu and his government has, him and his government, they have everything that they need to move forward. They have a negotiated and agreed upon all parties settlement. Now, whether he moves forward and ensures the rescuing and return of the hostages, unfortunately, we now know that not all of them are alive. In fact, some leaked elements of the deal says that some of the remains of the hostages will return. That kind of ensures that not all the hostages are alive. But unless he moves now, unfortunately, I don't think any of the hostages will remain.
And with your experience with regards to the US, how much pressure do you think President Biden can bring to bear? How much influence can he bring to bear on this situation? He's obviously said that he wants that humanitarian aid to be flowing through into Gaza. He wants Hamas to return the hostages and so forth. He's very clearly laid out his red line. So how much influence will he have at this point?
Well, obviously, there are limitations. Israel is a sovereign country, and the Americans, being the closest ally, have some leeway, some way to pressure, but there are limitations. But let's not mince words. The Americans signed off with the Qataris, the Egyptians, and the UN on this current agreement or draft agreement. It needs to be approved by the Israelis, obviously, to be an agreement negotiated with all parties. So they've already approved this. They have mentioned that they don't want to see an incursion into Rafah. Unfortunately, the government of Netanyahu has ignored this. Now, it would be interesting to see what more can the Americans do. Some mentioned restrictions on military equipment. That has been done in the past, but that was in regard to Lebanon, not occupied land in Israel or Gaza or Palestinian occupied land. So that would be interesting. But right now, the focus should be on the negotiated deal. All parties have agreed upon. It is delivered with the Israelis, and we wait to see the answer.
Okay, Nawaf Al-Thani, thank you very much for your thoughts on this continuing story today. And we have just heard that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said, basically a repetition of what he said earlier, that Hamas's proposal falls far short of Israel's essential demands. That just in. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Now, I just want to take you live to the House of Commons here in London because the UK Defence Secretary, we're expecting him to speak in a few minutes. That's Grant Shapps. He's due to make a statement about a hack which has compromised the payroll system of the British Armed Forces. Government officials have told the BBC that China was most likely responsible, something the Chinese Foreign Ministry has dismissed as absurd. China's President Xi in Europe at the moment. He's in France. He's been having lunch with President Macron in the Pyrenees. So China dismissing the idea that it could be behind this hack as absurd. But we are expecting a statement from the UK Defence Secretary coming up in a short while, and we'll bring that to you. Ukrainian intelligence says it has foiled a Russian plot to assassinate President Zelensky. It's arrested 2 colonels from the Government Protection Unit suspected of passing on secret information to a Russian FSB cell. It's claimed they brought drones, explosives and mines to Kyiv from other Ukrainian regions to use in an attack. The plan was to follow Mr. Zelensky, abduct and murder him. They were reportedly recruited before the Russian invasion 2 years ago. Our Ukraine correspondent James Waterhouse has more.
Assassination plots against President Zelensky are common, and they have been since the full-scale invasion when Russian paratroopers attempted to land in Kyiv and take him out. But this is an alleged plan which really does stand out. You have the country's intelligence service claiming to have held 2 serving colonels in the country's security service, which is responsible for keeping institutions as well as senior officials safe. And they are accused of planning to leak President Zelensky and these other officials, their movements to Moscow, the details of how they're protected by security guards, as well as the addresses in which they stay. And the alleged plan was for those addresses to be struck by Russian missiles. But the detail doesn't stop there. These colonels reportedly took weapons from the Ukrainian regions where they were serving, which included drones, mines, explosives. They allegedly took them to Kyiv to carry out this attack. Now, we don't know how close these men got to carrying out their plan. It is claimed that they were hired by Moscow as moles before the full-scale invasion in meetings in other European countries where large sums of cash were transferred. It's got it all, really, this plot. But it's also a reminder of the dangers that President Zelensky, a wartime leader, faces in this conflict. This is a president who is keen to still travel around. He often makes visits to the front lines, some very hostile areas where he will be seen to meet troops, and often those journeys are made in low-flying helicopters. It's a means of transport which has claimed the lives of other top officials when a helicopter crashed a couple of years ago in heavy fog. But he has become accustomed to the risk. You know, this is a guy who was willing to stay despite offers to leave Ukraine early on in the full-scale invasion, and with this country still being in martial law, with elections still on hold, for now it seems he is intent on staying. But of course he still is now grappling with other political domestic issues as part of the job. That gloss of the early invasion has worn off now. He is now trying to mobilise as many men as possible for a fight that is not going Ukraine's way at the moment.
And that was James Waterhouse in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. Meanwhile, President Vladimir Putin has been sworn in for a new 6-year term at a ceremony at the Kremlin. Putin, who's been in power as president or prime minister since 1999, now begins his new mandate more than 2 years after he sent tens of thousands of troops into Ukraine. In March, Mr. Putin won a landslide victory in a tightly controlled election from which 2 anti-war candidates were barred on technical grounds. Britain, Canada and most European Union nations decided to boycott the swearing-in, but France said it would send its ambassador. Our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg told us more from Moscow.
After taking the oath of office, he pledged to serve the Russian people. He said he was open to dialogue with Western countries, but then he accused the West of displaying aggression towards Russia, of putting pressure on Russia. This, of course, from the the Kremlin leader who had launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago, who's waging war against Ukraine, but Russian officials turn all of that round and point the finger of blame at the West and accuse the West of waging war in Ukraine against Russia. After the ceremony, interestingly, we were in a position where we could speak to people we never usually have access to, and I managed to catch a word with Sergei Narishkin, who is the head of Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, and he said to me that he interpreted Putin's speech as an invitation to the West for mutual cooperation. Those were his words, but I suspect it will be viewed quite differently in Western nations. I mean, Britain, America and the European Union didn't send any representatives to Putin's inauguration ceremony today, and that reflects, I think, the level of tension there is between Moscow and the West at the moment.
Steve Rosenberg in Moscow. It's been revealed that Prince Harry will not meet his father, the King, during his visit to the UK this week. A spokesman for the Duke of Sussex said a meeting between father and son wasn't possible because of the King's busy schedule. Harry is in London to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Invictus Games, which he set up to help rehabilitate wounded or sick service personnel. And do stay with us here on BBC News. Just a reminder that we are expecting a statement from the UK Defence Secretary. This is about a hack which has compromised the payroll system of the British Armed Forces. Government officials have told the BBC that China was most likely responsible, something China has dismissed as absurd.